Pop, I'm sorry for you. I'm sorry.
He was captivating.
We have some breaking news to bring you. The legendary actor Robert Redford, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood in the 1970s, we have just had it confirmed that Robert Redford has died. He was 89.
September 16th, 2025. In the stillness of his home in Utah, the final breath of Robert Redford, the man who once defined an entire era, quietly slipped away. The cinematic world seemed to pause in a grief-stricken silence as Hollywood's immortal icon closed the extraordinary journey of his life at the age of 89. The loss leaves behind an irreplaceable void, not only for his family but also for millions of admirers across the globe. For more than 6 decades, Redford was never just a face on the silver screen. He was the very soul that elevated cinema into an art form. From his Oscar-winning Ordinary People to the founding of Sundance, the sanctuary of independent film, he inscribed a radiant chapter in cultural history. Yet behind the glory were wounds that never healed. The death of his first son, painful losses that shadowed him throughout his life, sorrows carried in silence. And then, fate delivered its final merciless blow, taking away a warrior who had turned tragedy into art, who had lit pain into flames that touched the deepest corners of the human heart. Now his passing is more than the end of a man. It is the fall of a monument. The extinguishing of a flame after it had illuminated generations. The eternal silence of a voice that once thundered against injustice, once sang of love, loss, and resilience. And yet, within this mourning, lingers his late-life confession about Paul Newman, his friend, his brother, his soulmate, who had stood with him in creating some of Hollywood's most glorious moments. Those words, spoken at the twilight of his life, were not only remembrance but also testimony to a rare, steadfast, and profoundly human friendship between two legends. They met as two opposing poles: Paul Newman, witty and playful; Robert Redford, calm and reserved. Yet instead of letting their differences create distance, they bridged them with something rare in Hollywood: absolute respect for one another. On set, neither tried to outshine the other. Instead, they willingly stepped back to let their partner radiate. Off-screen, they became anchors for each other, keeping one another from losing their way in a world full of temptations. Perhaps that is why Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting were not just box office hits, but also proof of a friendship where two legends lifted each other up rather than competing for the summit. At 89, as Robert Redford closed the extraordinary journey of his life, the cinematic world bowed in grief. But in that heavy silence, his late confession about Paul Newman rose like a spiritual testament, both painful and sacred. In those final moments, Redford did not speak of awards, nor did he recall personal triumphs. He spoke of a friendship that endured for decades, with Newman, the friend, the brother, the soulmate who had walked with him both on and off the screen. Redford once admitted that Newman was the kind of man who made everyone around him better. At the peak of fame, Newman remained humble and kind, never allowing stardom to overshadow his true self. To Redford, that was not only admirable, but also a profound bond. A rare friendship tested and proven in the harsh crucible of Hollywood, where most relationships easily crumble under competition. When recalling their days working together, Redford often described a kind of unspoken understanding. On set, a glance or a small gesture was enough for them to catch each other's meaning. In every scene, their mutual respect pushed them to elevate one another, not for awards or applause, but for the pure love of the craft. They would spend hours backstage discussing character motivations, experimenting with improvised lines, bursting into laughter when a spontaneous moment worked, and sinking into silence when a scene touched something deep in the soul. It was this harmony that made Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting not only box office triumphs, but benchmarks in film history, where true friendship shone alongside art. Yet what moved Redford most was not the legendary roles, but Newman in everyday life. A friend like an older brother, always there when he was needed most, in grief, in doubt, in search of advice, or simply to share a quiet companionship. Redford once choked up, saying, "Paul taught me that true success isn't measured by fame or money, but by kindness, integrity, and the impact you leave on people." For Redford, Newman was not just a co-star, but a moral compass, a steady hand that kept him from straying in a dazzling yet treacherous world. In his final remembrance, Redford did not portray Newman as a larger-than-life legend, but as a flesh-and-blood man, full of warmth, overflowing with compassion, leaving indelible marks in the hearts of friends and colleagues. And through this confession, the world now glimpses a priceless treasure, the story of a friendship rare, enduring, and deeply human. The very thing that made Redford and Newman not only a legendary duo of Hollywood, but symbols of what it means to live with loyalty, humility, and love. Before he became one of Hollywood's brightest lights, Robert Redford was just a frail boy at the fragile dawn of his life, lying motionless on a narrow bed, his small body paralyzed by polio, his young soul swallowed by shadows unseen by any audience. Those shadows weighed on him like a silent sentence, as if fate had tested early on just how much pain the heart of a legend could endure. Robert Redford was born on August 18, 1936, in Santa Monica, California, the only child of Charles and Martha. His childhood unfolded against the backdrop of an America still scarred by the Great Depression. The Redfords were a working-class family, not destitute, but never comfortable. They eventually settled in Van Nuys, a Los Angeles suburb where rows of modest houses sat under the relentless Southern California sun. Inside that home, young Robert grew up caught between two opposing influences. His father, Charles Redford Sr., a laboratory technician, was strict, unemotional, a figure of discipline and severity. His mother, Martha Hart, by contrast, was a free-spirited illustrator, gentle, sensitive, and always encouraging her son to nurture his imagination. She planted in Robert a love for beauty and the belief that art could open a world far larger than the four walls of their working-class home. But Redford's childhood was never smooth. Around the age of 10, disaster struck. He contracted polio. Long months followed, confined to a bed, his legs refusing to obey him, haunted by the fear of a life condemned to disability. Redford later recalled those days as a darkness that consumed his boyhood. Yet in that room, heavy with the smell of disinfectant, Martha never gave up. Night after night, she massaged her son's stiff legs, whispering words of hope. She taught him that strength did not always come from grand victories, but sometimes from the quiet refusal to surrender. From that darkness, Redford learned his first lesson about the fragility of life and the profound value of resilience. As his health gradually returned, Redford entered adolescence restless, hungry to break free from the limits around him. He was no model teenager. He slipped into reckless escapades, caught up with delinquent friends in wild Los Angeles nights. Once, the police stopped him for mischief, a warning that his path could easily veer toward ruin. Fortunately, his stern father pulled him back from the brink, and Robert found a different outlet: painting, sports, and the open skies. A sketchbook and brush gave him a quiet refuge. The vast sky awakened dreams of escaping the narrow confines of his childhood, and sports, especially tennis, gave him a sense of control over himself. He once had an unforgettable moment, warming up alongside Pancho Gonzalez, the legendary champion, at the Los Angeles Tennis Club. It flashed by like lightning, but it was enough for the boy to realize he could reach beyond the gray streets of Van Nuys. Still, fate was not finished with him. In 1955, when Redford was only 18, the greatest loss of his life struck. His mother, the woman who had massaged his legs during the polio years, who had instilled in him faith in beauty and the strength of hope, entered the operating room and never returned. A post-surgical infection took her away. The house, already quiet, was reduced to just two figures: a withdrawn father and a bewildered son, hollowed by grief. Redford later admitted, "That year, the ground collapsed beneath my feet." The collapse did not just take away the person he loved most. It carved into him a void that could never be filled. That void followed him all his life, echoing even in his moments of glory. It became a haunting silence, so that every applause, every ovation, reverberated against an undertone of absence. And perhaps it was those early cracks in his childhood that shaped Redford into a singular artist. A man who knew how to use art to transform private sorrow into a universal voice. After his mother's death, the emptiness in Redford's soul only grew wider. He carried the fractures of childhood, the hollowness of loss, and a spirit that was never at peace. In 1956, at the age of 19, Redford entered the University of Colorado with the intention of studying architecture. He had once hoped that straight lines and solid forms might bring a new order, a sense of stability to a life that had lost its anchor. But reality was harsh. In those dry technical classes, Redford never found peace. Amid the cold drafts and rigid designs, he felt like a wanderer out of place. Architecture demanded discipline and precision, but his young heart cried endlessly for freedom. After only a short time, by the late 1950s, Redford decided to abandon the university, as though he could not bear to live another day inside the narrow frame society had drawn for him. From then on, he slipped into long days drowned in alcohol, nights without direction, letting himself drift into chaos. Yet, instead of locking himself away in some dark corner of America, Redford chose to set out. At 20, he began wandering across Europe. From the artist-filled streets of Paris, to the noisy taverns of Spain, to the sunlit squares of Italy, every place he touched felt like an escape. He was running from the suffocating silence at home, from the void left by his mother's death. These journeys were not leisure trips. They were a form of self-imposed exile, where he both sought to destroy himself and desperately searched for a way out. Years later, Redford admitted that it was a lost chapter of his life, yet it was in that very lostness that he first discovered the light of art. Amid drunken nights and aimless steps, he picked up the paintbrush again, spent hours watching street theater, and found himself captivated by the films projected in Europe's small cinemas. He realized that only art had the power to turn chaos into order, wounds into language, and private pain into a universal voice. Around 1958, at just over 22 years old, Redford returned to America. He was no longer the uncertain college student he once had been. Instead, he carried with him a determination to find a new home. He moved to New York and enrolled in the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. A fateful decision. It was there, in the demanding acting classes, on cramped but challenging stages, that he began to build himself a different life. The stage, the lights, and the audience became his new home, where he was no longer only running away, but learning to confront and transform tragedy into art. And now, as the world mourns his passing at the age of 89, the value of those first steps becomes even clearer. The frail young man who once trembled on the small stages of New York was the very one who laid the foundation for an immortal legend. His death has stunned the film world, but it also forces us to look back at the path he once walked. For Robert Redford was not born a monument. He was once just a young man carrying private wounds, struggling to find his place. And it was from those first beginnings on the Broadway stage that the first light of a legend began to shine. In 1959, Robert Redford cautiously stepped into New York's theater world. A harsh place where hundreds of young hopefuls jostled daily for a chance, but only a few managed to survive. At first, audiences were easily drawn to his handsome face, his fine features recalling the classical elegance of Hollywood's golden era, his bright eyes shadowed by a distant sadness. In a city where looks could open doors to the stage, Redford had a clear advantage. But what set him apart was not his appearance. Even in small roles, Redford left an impression by acting as though he drew directly from his childhood fractures, from the loss of his mother, from his years of wandering in Europe. Audiences felt a rare truth. Each of Redford's characters carried a fragile vitality, both proud and vulnerable, just like the man himself. By the early 1960s, that persistence began to pay off. New York critics started to take notice of the young actor for his emotional depth, his discipline, and his refusal to be confined. He knew how to restrain himself on stage, allowing every glance, every gesture to linger in the minds of the audience. The turning point came in 1963, when Redford landed the lead role in Barefoot in the Park, Neil Simon's romantic comedy. On the Broadway stage, he became the young newlywed lawyer, witty, passionate, and clumsy in marriage. His natural charm and ability to capture subtle emotional conflicts made Redford shine brilliantly. The play quickly became a phenomenon, celebrated by critics and embraced warmly by audiences. During these same early 1960s years, alongside Broadway, Robert Redford began stepping into the world of television, then exploding across America and becoming a household entertainment staple. His appearances on the small screen were not major roles, but they were golden opportunities for a young actor to train and test himself in a wide variety of characters. From Maverick, the popular Western, to Perry Mason, the famed legal drama, to Alfred Hitchcock Presents, the classic thriller anthology, Redford left his mark in each. With every role, he learned to control his pacing before the camera, so different from the expansive energy of the stage. Television demanded a subtler craft. Every glance, every small movement mattered, for the audience could see everything up close. These roles, though only the beginning, paved the way for a journey that could not be reversed, from Broadway to Hollywood. A journey where, from that point forward, the name Robert Redford would no longer be tied only to private grief, but would begin to write a new chapter in the history of American cinema. The true turning point came in 1969, when Robert Redford was cast as the Sundance Kid in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. This was not just a role. It was the ticket that propelled him straight into the ranks of Hollywood's biggest stars. Before that, Redford had played several leading roles, but none that truly broke him through. Then the opportunity arrived. Though at first, many producers were doubtful, believing Redford was too little known to stand alongside an A-list star like Paul Newman, but director George Roy Hill saw something different in him. A coolness tinged with rebellion, bright eyes shadowed with melancholy, and the aura of an outsider. Perfect for Sundance Kid. When the film premiered, audiences worldwide were instantly captivated. The Newman-Redford duo became one of the most legendary pairings in cinematic history. Newman's Butch Cassidy, witty, mischievous, full of humor, against Redford's Sundance Kid, calm, steely, yet irresistibly magnetic. Their near-perfect chemistry turned every scene into a classic, from their sharp banter to the tense chase sequences, moments audiences could not look away from. This role transformed Redford from a promising face into a global star. Audiences admired not only his rare matinee idol looks, but also his subtle, restrained acting, just enough to shine alongside Newman without being overshadowed. The success of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid marked a new era for Redford, from a New York stage actor to a world cinema icon. Redford also became inseparably tied to the name Sundance, at first only the identity of a screen character, but gradually his personal symbol. Years later, he would give that name to the Sundance Institute, 1981, and the Sundance Film Festival, institutions that rewrote the history of independent cinema. What began as an outlaw cowboy on screen became a banner of creative freedom, of breaking convention, and of giving generations of young filmmakers a voice. After the resounding success of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, audiences had barely recovered from the fever when, in 1973, Robert Redford and Paul Newman reunited in The Sting. Set during the Great Depression, the film told the story of two clever con men, and once again, the duo's sparkling interplay enchanted viewers. If Butch Cassidy had painted them as reckless outlaws, The Sting revealed another side, sharp, witty, and irresistibly charismatic in every scheme. The film was not only a box office triumph, but also won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. For Redford, The Sting marked a milestone, his first Oscar nomination for Best Actor, a well-deserved recognition that he was far more than just a handsome face. From this moment on, Robert Redford's image was indelibly etched into cinematic memory as one of the finest actors of his generation. And beyond the accolades, the film cemented a special friendship. On screen, they were outlaws, bonded yet defiant. Off-screen, Redford and Newman found a rare connection. Two great stars who had no need to compete, only to walk side by side. That friendship, as Redford admitted decades later, remained one of the deepest bonds of his life. Beyond acting, Robert Redford was celebrated as a visionary filmmaker and a pioneering voice in championing independent cinema. At the height of his career, instead of basking in the glow of stardom, he chose another path. The path of a guide, a door opener for the generations to come. He founded the Sundance Institute, a nonprofit born from his desire to give young filmmakers the chance to experiment, to fail, and to discover their own voices without being shackled by Hollywood's rigid rules. From this foundation, the Sundance Film Festival was created, quickly becoming the most prestigious independent film festival in the world. It became the birthplace of countless directors, actors, and screenwriters, from Quentin Tarantino with Reservoir Dogs to Steven Soderbergh with Sex, Lies, and Videotape, to Darren Aronofsky with Pi. Redford gave them a platform, and in return, they enriched global cinema. Redford's commitment to creative freedom and fresh storytelling changed the face of American film. He believed that art could only truly live when it dared to break patterns and allowed new voices to rise. Thanks to Sundance, thousands of independent films have found their way to audiences, creating a strong current running alongside mainstream Hollywood. In this way, Redford turned the very idea of patron into an enduring legacy. Alongside building Sundance, Redford also established himself as a filmmaker in his own right. The first time he sat in the director's chair, he stunned the world with Ordinary People. The film explored the tragedy of an American family after the death of a son, delving deep into psychological wounds and the silence that corrodes relationships. With no excess, no wasted frames, Ordinary People reached into the darkest corners of the human heart. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, while Redford himself took home Best Director. With this debut, he proved his talent extended far beyond being in front of the camera. He could use the language of cinema to tell stories both haunting and profoundly human. While Sundance grew, Redford continued to shine on screen. In The Natural, he portrayed Roy Hobbs, a seemingly superhuman baseball player, yet one full of vulnerabilities. His blend of epic stature and fragile sensitivity turned the role into a symbol. Then came Out of Africa, the sweeping romantic epic based on Karen Blixen's memoir, in which he once again captivated the world. The image of Redford flying with Meryl Streep over the skies of Kenya became an immortal moment in film, romantic and tinged with melancholy. During this time, Redford also expanded his directing career. He chose The Milagro Beanfield War, a socially conscious story that laid bare the tensions between community, power, and corruption. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it showed clearly that Redford was developing a style of direction that was both artistically refined and socially aware. Then came A River Runs Through It, a milestone. The film followed two brothers in a Montana minister's family, exploring kinship, loss, and the fragile beauty of nature. Redford not only directed, but also guided the audience with a slow, poetic narration. He gave a then-unknown Brad Pitt his breakout role, proving that cinema could be transformed into a visual poem. Critics praised Redford's sensitivity and refinement, calling it one of the clearest examples of his ability to turn film into lyrical experience. Next, he boldly directed Quiz Show. Rather than choosing a safe script, Redford revisited the 1950s American television scandal when quiz shows were rigged to boost ratings. The film raised tough questions about ethics, media power, and the corruption of society. Redford struck a delicate balance between drama and historical accuracy, forcing audiences to ask themselves, does truth still matter in a world ruled by money and power? By the late 1990s, he both directed and starred in The Horse Whisperer. The story of healing, both for people and for wounded horses, embodied Redford's life philosophy. That art, like life itself, is the journey of mending what is broken. His dual role did not weigh the film down. Instead, it showcased his rare ability to keep clarity and authenticity in every detail. Even into the 21st century, Redford never stopped. In Lions for Lambs, he played a university professor questioning personal responsibility in a turbulent political and social climate. With The Conspirator, he returned to directing, revisiting the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and its consequences, continuing his lifelong interest in justice and the complexities of morality. Then, The Company You Keep reaffirmed Redford's multifaceted artistry as director, actor, and storyteller, probing the shadows of political activism and personal secrets. What made Redford extraordinary was not just the list of acclaimed films, but his ability to bridge two worlds. On one side, the glitter of Hollywood, and on the other, the risk-taking spirit of independent cinema. He remained a box office draw, yet also the patron who gave unheard voices the chance to rise. And it was in that role, the role of a sower, that Redford left his greatest legacy, turning Sundance into a beacon for all who dared to dream of a cinema free and unbound. Redford never separated his private life from the marks of tragedy. Just as his career was beginning to shine, he found love with Lola Van Wagenen, a woman of intelligence and gentleness who had stood by him since his days of struggle. They married in 1958 when Redford was only in his early 20s, and together they built what seemed like a warm, complete home. In that house, 4 children were born in turn, bringing with them the hope of a whole family. Yet, from the very beginning, fate left a wound that would never heal. Their first son, Scott Anthony, was born healthy, but only 2 months later, sudden infant death claimed his fragile life. For Redford, it was a devastating blow. He later admitted that no glory, no Oscar, no thunderous applause could ever fill that void. In every role touching on loss, in every glance that seemed to falter before the camera, one could sense the shadow of that private grief he never let go. Scott remained forever present, a scar that followed Redford on every path, a reminder that happiness is fragile and life is never fair. Even so, Redford and Lola continued to nurture their family. They raised their 3 surviving children in warmth, striving not to let that first tragedy fracture their home. The children grew and chose their own paths, among them David James Redford, their second son, who revealed an early passion for art and became a talented filmmaker, carrying forward a piece of his father's creative flame. Yet once again, fate was merciless. In 2020, David passed away from liver cancer after years of struggle, leaving behind his wife, children, and an unfinished body of work. For Redford, David's death was another wound, deepening the emptiness that had never been filled since Scott's passing. Nearing 90, he had to witness 2 sons depart before him, a pain no father could ever explain. Amid the glamour of Hollywood, Redford remained simply a grieving father, a man whose heart had been shattered more times than any tragic role he ever played on screen. And it was precisely this quiet endurance that earned him even greater respect. Robert Redford was not only a cinematic legend, but also a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of life's most private losses. His first marriage lasted nearly 3 decades before ending in divorce. They had weathered the lean years of his struggling career together, shared the glow of his stardom when his name reached the heights, and endured tragedies that could never be erased, especially the loss of their first son. But the pressures of work, the distances that grew, and the inner turmoil that Redford carried gradually strained the marriage. After almost 30 years, it ended in divorce, a conclusion that left him with regret, but also opened a long chapter of solitude. For many years afterward, Redford kept his heart closed, devoting himself to his children, his work, and his great artistic projects like Sundance. He seemed to accept that romantic love was no longer something he could hold on to. Yet fate still had one late gift. In 2009, when he was already in his 70s, Redford married for the second time. This time to Sibylle Sagars, a German painter much younger than him. This was not a loud Hollywood romance, nor a lavish, ostentatious ceremony. Everything happened quietly, simply, yet filled with warmth. Sibylle was not only his wife, but also his artistic soulmate. She shared with Redford a passion for creativity, a love of nature, and a desire to live a meaningful life. They often retreated to their ranch in Utah, where the sunset lit up the mountains, spending their days painting, writing, talking, and living in the silence Redford had always longed for. That late love brought him a rare peace after a life of storms. In his final years, Redford was no longer the star chasing the spotlight, but simply an old man with the woman he loved, savoring each quiet morning and each blazing sunset. And in that simplicity, he found what fame, wealth, and glory had never given him: a true home for his soul. On the day he took his last breath in his Utah home, that image became all the more poignant. Robert Redford, the man who once defined an era, who reached the highest peaks of artistic triumph, finally departed in the embrace of the peace he had always sought. Amid boundless mourning, the world understood that if there was one place where he truly rested, it was beside his soulmate wife, beneath the Utah sky, where he had spent his final days with the tranquility that a turbulent life so rarely grants. On the day Robert Redford passed, people did not only mourn a cinematic legend, they also remembered the image of a man who once captivated an entire generation. He was one of the most handsome faces in Hollywood during the 1970s and 1980s, with golden hair, piercing blue eyes, and a wanderer's charm that few could match. So much so that decades later, the media would often call Brad Pitt the Redford of a new generation. But Redford was never just a beauty icon or an A-list star. Beyond the spotlight, he was one of the rare artists who turned personal influence into social power. Beginning in the 1970s, when most of Hollywood was consumed by careers and lavish indulgence, Redford chose another path, devoting himself to environmental activism. He campaigned to preserve America's public lands, supported biodiversity conservation, and opposed oil and gas projects that destroyed nature. He frequently wrote articles, participated in hearings, and often used his own fame to pressure governments into adopting stronger policies against climate change. Redford was also a pioneering voice in advocating for clean energy while opposing coal and fossil fuels. He worked with numerous nonprofit and international organizations, including the Natural Resources Defense Council and the United Nations, to raise global awareness of the environmental crisis. For Redford, art and nature were two sides of the same thread. One nurtured human emotion, the other sustained life itself. Utah, where he spent the last decades of his life, was more than a place of rest. It stood as a testament to his love for nature. He built it into a hub for independent cinema, while also protecting its lands from commercial exploitation. For him, standing before snow-capped mountains or vast stretches of forest was where human beings truly found freedom. The very freedom Redford had been searching for since he was a boy carrying wounds that would never fully heal. When Robert Redford closed his eyes for the last time, it was as if Hollywood lost a heartbeat. His old films lit up the screen once more, but this time, those eyes and that smile were no longer symbols of hope. They were echoes of a chapter now closed. Before the camera, He once told stories of love, loss, and human resilience. Now, that voice has fallen silent, leaving behind a pause that made friends, colleagues, and audiences alike realize a piece of cinema's soul had departed with him. Yet, in that emptiness, Robert Redford's legacy shone brighter than ever. He was the immortal Sundance Kid, with that gaze both rebellious and melancholic in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He was the clever drifter, every sly smile perfectly timed in the sting. He was the figure of longing and solitude in Out of Africa, leaving haunting images of love and loss. And beyond the screen, Redford built a true temple for independent film, the Sundance Institute and Sundance Film Festival, where thousands of artistic dreams were nurtured. On screen, he was the storyteller. In life, he was the author of an entire chapter of creative freedom. All of Hollywood bowed its head at the news of his passing. Jane Fonda wept as she called Redford a beautiful man in every sense, from his soul and character to his career. Scarlett Johansson recalled the tenderness in his eyes when, as a teenage girl on the set of The Horse Whisperer, he held her hand and taught her to listen to her character rather than simply act. Meryl Streep uttered in grief, "One of the lions has gone," as though Hollywood itself had lost one of its last great pillars. Barbra Streisand wrote at length on her personal page, remembering every day of filming The Way We Were, calling it pure joy and a gift life rarely bestows. Directors like Ron Howard and Martin Scorsese sent their farewells. Even politicians and writers spoke of Redford as a symbol of justice and art. It wasn't only Hollywood. The whole world bowed. From America to Europe, the press called him an immortal legend, the last monument of a golden age. Millions of posts, stories, and old photographs flooded social media. Some recalled the moment they wept watching ordinary people. Others remembered their hearts racing at the first sight of the Sundance Kid's smile. And some simply wrote, R.I.P. Redford, with a broken heart emoji. Each farewell was a testament that Robert Redford was not only an actor, not only a director, but a living memory for generations, a piece inseparable from both the history of cinema and the spiritual life of humanity. Robert Redford went through life carrying too many wounds: the death of his firstborn son, losses that followed, and the silent emptiness that had shadowed him since childhood. Yet instead of letting them drown him, he turned them into lessons, into resilience, into art. He showed the world that even when life takes away what is most precious, a person can still rise, keep creating, and continue giving faith and hope. Perhaps that is why his passing today feels so staggering. Because Redford was never a distant monument. He was always close, like a part of our collective memory. Redford's greatness did not lie in fame, but in endurance. Not in applause, but in humanity. And now, as the curtain of his life has closed, the best way to honor him is not through cold headlines, but through sincere remembrance. A whispered thank you, a memory retold, a tearful glance at the smile of the Sundance Kid, or a scene in Ordinary People that pierced our hearts. Redford rests, but his echo remains. In every filmmaker he lifted up at Sundance, in every audience member who once wept or smiled because of him, in every heart that has refused to surrender to pain. His absence is vast, yet the legacy he leaves will go on shining, like a flame that will never extinguish in humanity's memory. Today, the world has lost a torch, and all we have left are memories. If you were ever moved by his gaze, leave a comment saying R.I.P. Robert Redford to remember, to give thanks to a man who gave the world far more than the glow of the silver screen.